My name is Sarah. I used to believe that family meant belonging somewhere, until I learned that some of us are just visitors in our own bloodline. I still remember the way their laughter hit me that night. Sharp, dismissive, almost rehearsed. It wasn't the kind of laughter born from humor, but from disbelief. Disbelief that I, the quiet one, the one who had always stood at the periphery of family conversations, dared to raise my voice at our annual Thanksgiving gathering. We were sitting around that impossibly long dining table, the same one where I'd spent 27 years learning my place. Each seat carried a silent ranking. Grandma Ruth at the head, her eyes sharp as ever despite her 84 years. Dad and Uncle Mark flanked her sides, their voices always the loudest, their opinions always the most valued. Mom sat where she always did, nodding along, her own thoughts buried beneath decades of learned silence. My cousins scattered around, the middle, their confidence inherited like family jewelry, passed down from generation to generation, but somehow never reaching me. And then there was my chair, third from the end, right next to the kitchen door, where I could slip away unnoticed when the conversations grew too heavy with importance I wasn't allowed to carry. The discussion that night centered around Mom's foundation project, a literacy program she'd been developing for underserved communities. I'd been following her work closely, even helping her research methodologies and trauma-informed approaches during our quiet phone calls. I knew more about that project than anyone at the table, but that didn't matter. It never had. When I tried to speak, to contribute something meaningful about the psychological barriers that prevent trauma survivors from engaging with traditional literacy programs, I barely got 2 sentences out before the ripple began. "Sarah's got some ideas," Mom said, her voice carrying that apologetic tone she always used when introducing me, as if she needed to warn people that I might actually have something to say. I cleared my throat, my heart already racing. Actually, I've been researching trauma-informed communication approaches, and there's this fascinating connection between... That's when it started. A smirk from Aunt Carla, a barely concealed chuckle from Uncle Mark. Then my cousin Jake, always the comedian, let out a snort that he tried to cover with his napkin. "Sorry," he said, not looking sorry at all. "Continue, Sarah. We're all ears." But they weren't. I could see it in their faces. That familiar mixture of condescension and amusement. They were waiting for me to stumble, to confirm what they'd always believed about me. That I was still the girl who used to hide behind Mom's skirt at family parties, who cried when Uncle Mark teased me about my lisp, who spent every gathering reading in corner chairs because conversation felt like a foreign language I'd never quite mastered. "Let her finish," Aunt Carla said between barely suppressed giggles, not to defend me, but to stretch the joke. "This should be interesting." I felt my face flush hot. The words I'd carefully prepared, words about neuroplasticity and linguistic accessibility, about the research I'd been conducting for the past 3 years, suddenly felt foolish in my mouth. I smiled faintly. That practiced smile I'd perfected over decades of swallowing humiliation, and let my voice trail off. "Never mind," I whispered. "It's not important," but it was important, and they knew it. That's what made their laughter so cruel. Not that they disagreed with me, but that they couldn't even imagine I might have something valuable to contribute. Before we continue, drop a comment. Where are you watching this from, and what time is it there? I'd love to know how far this story is reaching. Sometimes, when we feel most alone, we need to remember that someone, somewhere, understands. I left the table early that night, blaming a headache. The truth was more complicated. It wasn't physical pain I was running from. It was the ache of being misunderstood, the exhaustion of years spent trying to prove I had something to offer to people who had already decided I didn't. I drove home in silence, my hands shaking slightly on the steering wheel. The familiar weight of invisibility settled over me like a blanket I'd worn too many times. In the rearview mirror, I could see the warm glow of my childhood home, where my family continued their important conversations without me, probably relieved. They didn't have to pretend to listen anymore. That night, I sat in my small apartment and made a decision that would change everything, though I didn't know it then. I opened my laptop and began typing, not an angry letter or a social media post, but a research proposal. If my family couldn't see my value, perhaps the rest of the world could. I'd spent the last decade quietly building my expertise in trauma linguistics, the study of how psychological wounds affect our ability to communicate and be heard. It started as personal curiosity, a way to understand why my own voice seemed to disappear in crowded rooms. But over the years, it had become something more. I remembered the moment I first discovered this field. I was 22, fresh out of college, working as a research assistant at the university, while my cousins were landing impressive jobs at law firms and tech companies. My family saw my work as temporary, a stepping stone to something real. They'd ask when I planned to get a proper job, their voices tinged with that gentle concern that felt more like disappointment. But I found something in that research lab that I'd never found at family dinners. My voice mattered. Dr. Elizabeth Martinez, my supervisor, actually listened when I spoke. She asked follow-up questions. She challenged my ideas not to diminish them, but to sharpen them. When I presented my first paper on linguistic adaptation in trauma survivors, she smiled and said, "Sarah, you have a gift for making complex ideas accessible. Don't ever underestimate that." I hadn't told my family about that presentation, or the one after that, or the conference where I was invited to deliver a keynote on communication barriers in therapeutic settings. Each success felt too fragile to share with people who had already decided what I was capable of. Instead, I let them maintain their version of me, the awkward cousin who worked with books and lived alone because she was too shy to date properly. It was easier than fighting for recognition I wasn't sure I deserved. But that night, after their laughter had stripped away the last of my illusions about family acceptance, something shifted. I stopped trying to prove myself to them and started proving myself to myself. I threw myself into my research with the intensity that surprised even me. I spent weekends in archives, evenings conducting interviews with trauma survivors, nights analyzing speech patterns and communication breakdowns. I wasn't working toward their approval anymore. I was working toward my own understanding of why some voices get heard while others fade into silence. The breakthrough came 8 months later. I was analyzing recorded therapy sessions when I noticed a pattern. Trauma survivors often spoke in fragments, their sentences trailing off not because they didn't have more to say, but because they'd learned that completing their thoughts led to dismissal or re-traumatization. They were protecting themselves by becoming invisible. I recognized that pattern. I'd been living it my entire life. The paper I wrote about this discovery was accepted at the International Conference on Trauma Communication. Then it was cited in 3 major journals. Then I was invited to consult with therapeutic programs across the country. But the real validation came from the survivors themselves. People who told me that my research had helped them understand why they'd lost their voices, and more importantly, how to find them again. Still, I shared none of this with my family. They weren't interested in my work, and I was tired of offering proof to people committed to their old image of me. When Mom asked about my job during our monthly phone calls, I gave vague answers about research projects and consulting work. When Dad wondered aloud why I wasn't married yet, I changed the subject instead of mentioning the colleagues who respected my expertise, the conferences where I was treated as an authority, the life I'd built where my voice carried weight. I used to fantasize about confronting them, walking into one of their gatherings with my credentials displayed like armor, demanding the respect I'd earned. But that fantasy always ended the same way, with them finding new ways to diminish what I'd accomplished, new reasons why my success didn't really count. So I chose a different kind of revolution. I became undeniable, not to them, but to the world that mattered. I refined my research, accepted invitations to speak at universities, published papers that were read by people who had never laughed at my voice. I built a reputation brick by brick, word by word, in spaces where my family's opinions held no power. 3 years passed. 3 years of quiet growth, of finding my voice in rooms full of strangers who leaned in when I spoke, instead of waiting for me to stumble. I stopped attending family gatherings, citing work commitments that were actually true. I stopped explaining myself to people who had already decided who I was. And then, on a Tuesday in October, I received an email that would change everything. Dr. Sarah Chen, it began, and I paused, still not quite used to seeing my name paired with that title. We would like to invite you to serve as a panelist for our upcoming symposium on language, trauma, and resilience, voices that need to be heard. The event will be live-streamed nationally and is expected to reach over 50,000 viewers. I stared at the email for a full minute. This wasn't just another academic conference. This was the kind of platform that could shift entire conversations about trauma treatment and communication accessibility, and they wanted me. I accepted without hesitation, unaware that accepting this invitation would mean stepping into a spotlight that would reach all the way back to my childhood home, where my family had gathered to watch what they assumed would be another quiet gathering of academics discussing theories that didn't matter in the real world. The symposium was scheduled for a Saturday morning, prime time for the kind of educational programming that families like mine often had playing in the background while they prepared elaborate brunches and discussed more important things. I spent the week before preparing, not because I needed to, but because preparation had become my armor against uncertainty. I practiced my talking points in the mirror. The same mirror where I'd once rehearsed conversations I hoped to have with my family. But this time was different. This time, I wasn't practicing to be heard by people who had already decided I wasn't worth listening to. I was preparing to speak to thousands of people who had chosen to tune in because they believed the topic mattered. The morning of the symposium, I woke up in my hotel room in Chicago feeling something I hadn't experienced in years when it came to public speaking. Excitement instead of dread. I put on my navy blazer, the one I'd bought for my first conference presentation, when Dr. Martinez told me I needed to dress like the expert you are. I looked at myself in that hotel mirror and saw someone I was still learning to recognize. Dr. Sarah Chen, trauma communication specialist, sought-after consultant, published researcher, someone whose voice mattered. The symposium was held at the University of Chicago's gleaming conference center. As I walked into the green room, I was greeted by the other panelists, Dr. James Morrison from Harvard, Dr. Angela Rivera from Stanford, and Dr. Michael Jang from Johns Hopkins. These were names I'd seen in journals, people whose work I'd cited in my own papers, and now I was sitting beside them as an equal. Dr. Chen, Dr. Morrison said, extending his hand. I've read your work on linguistic fragmentation and trauma recovery. Brilliant stuff. I'm looking forward to hearing your perspective today. 20 years of family gatherings had never prepared me for this moment. The moment when someone I respected actually knew my work, had read my words, found value in my thoughts. I felt a small crack in the protective wall I'd built around my heart, the one that whispered I wasn't really qualified to be here. Meanwhile, 300 miles away in my hometown, my family was settling in for their usual Saturday morning routine. Mom was making her famous cinnamon rolls. Dad was reading the newspaper, occasionally sharing headlines that caught his attention. My cousins had stopped by with their children, turning the house into the kind of cheerful chaos that I'd once longed to be part of. Uncle Mark was flipping through channels when he landed on the symposium. Language, trauma, and resilience, he read aloud from the program guide. Sounds riveting, he said with his trademark sarcasm. Oh, leave it, Mom said from the kitchen. Sarah works in something like this. Maybe we'll learn what she actually does all day. They weren't really watching, not at first. It was background noise while they lived their Saturday lives, the kind of educational programming they could claim they watched without actually paying attention. But then the moderator began introducing the panelists. Our next expert has spent the last decade researching how trauma affects our ability to communicate and be heard. Her groundbreaking work on linguistic adaptation has revolutionized how we approach therapy for survivors. Please welcome Dr. Sarah Chen from Northwestern University. The room in my childhood home went quiet, not the comfortable quiet of people listening, but the stunned quiet of people trying to process unexpected information. "Did he say Sarah Chen?" Aunt Carla asked. That's not our Sarah, is it?" my cousin Jake said, leaning forward to look at the screen, but it was me. There I was, sitting on that panel in my navy blazer, my posture straight, my expression calm and confident. When the camera focused on me, I didn't look away or fidget or apologize for taking up space. I looked directly into the lens and smiled the kind of smile that comes from knowing exactly who you are and what you're worth. The first part of the symposium focused on research methodology and theoretical frameworks. I contributed to the discussion, my voice clear and steady, offering insights that the other panelists built upon with obvious respect. But the real moment came about halfway through the session. The moderator, Dr. Patricia Williams, had received several questions from the online audience about a particularly challenging aspect of trauma therapy, the phenomenon where survivors struggle to articulate their experiences, often leaving sentences unfinished or speaking in fragments that therapists struggle to understand. "This is a complex issue," Dr. Williams said, "and one that requires both clinical expertise and deep empathy. Dr. Chen, you've written extensively about this pattern. What's your perspective on why this happens? And more importantly, how can we as professionals better support these individuals?" The room fell silent, not just in Chicago, but in living rooms across the country where people were leaning closer to their screens. And 300 miles away, my family stopped their Saturday morning routines entirely. I took a breath, not from nervousness, but from the weight of responsibility I felt to the survivors whose stories had shaped my research. When I spoke, it wasn't with the tentative voice they remembered from family dinners, but with the authority I'd earned through years of listening to pain and learning to translate silence into understanding. When we look at linguistic fragmentation in trauma survivors, I began, we're not seeing communication failure. We're seeing communication adaptation. These individuals have learned, often through repeated experiences of dismissal or re-traumatization, that completing their thoughts can be dangerous. They trail off not because they don't have more to say, but because they're protecting themselves from the possibility that their full truth will be rejected, minimized, or used against them. I paused, thinking of all the times I'd done exactly that. Let my sentences fade into nothing rather than risk the full weight of someone else's disbelief. The therapeutic intervention isn't to push them to speak more, but to create spaces where partial truths are honored, where fragments are received with the same respect as complete narratives. Because sometimes, the bravest thing a person can do is offer you a piece of their story, even if they're not ready to share the whole thing yet. When I finished, there was a moment of silence that felt different from any I'd experienced in my family's home. This was the silence of people absorbing something meaningful, of professionals recognizing wisdom when they heard it. Dr. Morrison nodded thoughtfully. That reframes the entire clinical approach. Instead of seeing these communication patterns as problems to solve, we should see them as adaptations to honor. Exactly, Dr. Rivera added. Dr. Chen, have you developed specific protocols for therapists working with this population? And just like that, I was leading the conversation, not fighting to be heard, not justifying my right to speak, but guiding a discussion among peers who respected my expertise. The questions kept coming. From the other panelists, from the moderator, from the online audience. For 45 minutes, I was the primary voice on a national platform, sharing insights that people were genuinely eager to learn from. Back home, my family sat in complete silence. The cinnamon rolls grew cold on the counter. The children stopped playing to stare at the screen where their quiet cousin Sarah was being treated as an authority on subjects they'd never known she studied. I had no idea, Mom whispered. And for the first time in years, her voice carried something that sounded like awe instead of apology. "She's been doing this the whole time?" Dad asked, his newspaper forgotten in his lap. Uncle Mark, who had spent decades dismissing my attempts to contribute to family conversations, shook his head slowly. "We really didn't know, did we?" When the symposium ended, I felt something I'd never experienced after a family gathering, proud of how I'd used my voice. The other panelists shook my hand with genuine warmth. Dr. Williams pulled me aside to ask if I'd be interested in co-chairing next year's event. Conference attendees approached me with thoughtful questions and respectful disagreements that led to productive discussions. I walked out of that conference center feeling like I'd finally found my place in the world, not as someone fighting to be included, but as someone whose inclusion was valued and sought after. That evening, as I sat in my hotel room preparing to fly home, my phone began buzzing with notifications. Text messages from family members I hadn't heard from in months, missed calls from relatives who had never bothered to ask about my work before today. The first message was from Aunt Carla. "Sarah, I just watched the symposium. I had no idea about your work. Can we talk?" Then Mom, "Honey, I'm so proud. Why didn't you tell us about all of this?" Then Jake, "'Cause you were amazing today. I feel like an idiot for not knowing what you do." Even Uncle Mark sent a message. "Sarah, I owe you an apology. Several, actually. Your work is clearly important. I'd like to learn more if you're willing to share." I stared at these messages for a long time, feeling a complex mixture of emotions I couldn't quite name. Part of me wanted to respond immediately, to finally have the conversations I'd been longing for my entire life. Part of me wanted to ignore them entirely, to protect the peace I'd found in building a life where my worth wasn't determined by their approval. But mostly I felt something unexpected. Pity. Not the bitter kind that comes from superiority, but the gentle kind that comes from understanding. They hadn't known because they hadn't asked. They hadn't asked because they couldn't see past the version of me they'd created in their minds when I was 12 years old and afraid of my own shadow. I turned off my phone without responding to any of the messages. Not out of anger, but out of clarity. Their recognition of my worth, while gratifying, wasn't the source of my value. I'd learned that in rooms full of strangers who became colleagues, in research that helped real people reclaim their voices, in the quiet satisfaction of work that mattered whether or not anyone in my family ever understood it. 3 days later, I was back in my apartment, back to my normal routine of research and writing and consulting calls with therapeutic programs across the country. The symposium felt like a dream, except for the continuous stream of emails from professionals wanting to collaborate, speaking invitations from universities, and interview requests from podcasts focused on trauma recovery. My family's messages continued too, growing more frequent and more desperate in their attempts to bridge the gap they'd only just realized existed. Mom called daily, her voice carrying a new kind of respect, but also an old kind of need. The need to be included in my success now that it was undeniable. 2 weeks after the symposium, she called with what she thought was exciting news. "Sarah, I've been telling everyone about your work," she said, her voice bright with pride that felt both genuine and performative. "Mrs. Henderson from church asked if you'd come speak to their women's group about trauma recovery. And Aunt Carla wants to know if you could help her friend's daughter, who's struggling after her divorce." I listened to her enthusiasm, recognizing the familiar pattern. Now that my expertise had been validated by strangers, my family was eager to claim it, to benefit from it, to finally include me in their important conversations. But they still didn't understand the fundamental shift that had occurred. "Mom," I said gently, "I appreciate that you want to share my work, but I need you to understand something. This isn't new. I've been doing this research for 10 years. I've been helping people for 10 years. The only thing that's new is your awareness of it." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "I know, sweetheart. I know we should have asked more, should have listened better. Can we start over?" I considered her question seriously. Could we start over? Could I return to family? Dinners where my voice was suddenly welcome because the world had validated what I'd been trying to tell them all along? Could I pretend that their recognition mattered as much as it would have 5 years ago? We can start something new, I said, finally. But we can't pretend the past didn't happen. Your acceptance of my work now doesn't erase the years when you couldn't see its value. I'm not the same person who needed your approval to feel worthy of speaking. Another pause. Then, in a voice smaller than I'd ever heard from her, what can we do to fix this? You can start by understanding that there's nothing to fix, I told her. I'm not broken, and I'm not waiting for you to repair me. I built a life where my voice matters. If you want to be part of that life, you're welcome to join it. But you can't remake it in the image of what you think our family should be. The conversation ended quietly, without the dramatic reconciliation that movies had taught me to expect. But in its place was something more valuable. Honesty. The kind of honesty that comes when you stop trying to be the person others need you to be and start being the person you actually are. 6 months have passed since the symposium. My family and I have found a new rhythm, one based on mutual respect, rather than the old patterns of dismissal and desperate seeking for approval. Some of them have made genuine efforts to understand my work, to see me as I am rather than as they remember me being. Others have struggled with the shift, finding it easier to maintain distance than to confront their own assumptions. But here's what I've learned. The laughter that once defined me has faded into irrelevance. What remains is the sound of my own voice, no longer questioned, no longer small, no longer dependent on an audience that took decades to recognize its worth. Last week I received another speaking invitation. This time it's for the International Conference on Trauma Recovery, where I'll be delivering the opening keynote to an audience of 3,000 professionals from around the world. When I accepted, I didn't think about whether my family would be proud. I thought about the survivors whose stories shaped my research, the therapists who would carry these insights back to their practices, the voices that would be better heard because of work that began with my own silence. Sometimes justice doesn't roar. Sometimes it speaks quietly, steadily, to rooms full of people who choose to listen. And sometimes, the greatest victory isn't in proving your worth to those who doubted it. It's in discovering that their doubt was never the measure of your value at all. They deleted my name from their conversations for years, but they could never delete it from the work that matters.